And this is Chamomile and Clove, our All Souls podcast. Welcome back for chapters 34 through 36. We have a lot to talk about, but we also have some admin notes we wanted to get out of the way.
So, hey, Kate.
Hey, Jen.
Do you have your tickets to All Souls Con?
I do. What about you?
I do.
It's very exciting, you guys, not only because we are looking forward to All Souls Con so much, but also because this is Jen's first trip to Philadelphia, and I happen to go to school there, so I'm very, very excited to take her to my old stomping grounds, although she's told me she's not having mussels at Monk's, which means that I will have to eat them all for her.
You're going to be making a sacrifice. I understand.
Oh, I will. But they also make, like, killer burgers, and we'll find something for you to drink. It'll be fun.
Yes. And in addition to that, it will be also the first time we have, in fact, ever met in person. So,
right. So there will be much rejoicing for all sorts of reasons, because there will be witches and vampires and new friends and old friends, and it will be sweaty like a swamp. But we're going to Philadelphia in August. It is disgusting. Bring all of your sundresses and don't plan to be outside for very long. Or if you do, like, have something breezy. It's very sticky.
Yeah. I think that's the strategy, right? In the swampy places is just to like have all of the
airflow and like lots of water ice. So it's going to be very exciting, and I'm looking forward to it. What's our other news, Jen?
Our other news is that we have a bright and shiny new Facebook page, as well as a bright and shiny new Facebook discussion group. So if you perhaps do not do Twitter, which lots of people don't, and that is totally fine, you can now find us over at our Chamomile and Clove page on Facebook, and our discussion group, which are the CC Clovers, which we have just decided to call you guys, so you're welcome.
Indeed. Hello, Clovers. It's nice to meet you.
Clovers.
In any case, thank you to those of you who have already joined. It's been really lovely to see you there, and we will start putting more content and more questions and more thoughts for you guys to engage with on that page as we move through the books, and especially as we wrap up A Discovery of Witches, because we're not that many chapters away. Thank you also to those of you who have sent us wrap-up ideas and things that we will talk about in the episodes between when we finish this book and when we start Shadow of Night. So, without further ado, shall we get into our chapter breakdown?
We shall.
Indeed. So, as we said, we are covering chapters 34 through 36. When we open chapter 34, Matthew and Diana are still at the Bishop House, and Matthew is standing outside in the dawn sunlight, practicing the prana mudra. He invites Diana to do the same, and we discover that when she's not panicking, she's actually quite good at drawing water out of the ground and at letting the power pass through her. They come back inside, and everyone's sort of happy and fuzzy. Diana begins to fiddle with her toast, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, there is a butter container that flies out of the refrigerator to everyone's delight and surprise, at which point Anne, Sarah, and Matthew try to understand or unpick the riddle of Diana's magic. Matthew decides that it is related to her need, and that her parents bound up her ability to summon her magic and what she truly needs as opposed to the things that she wants. That leads us into the house having some very distinct opinions about who needs to be where, and it produces a final letter from Stephen and Rebecca, as well as a page from Ashmole 782 depicting the chemical wedding. There is much tragedy and much pain and much emotional labor. And before we get to chapter 35, we have a revelation that Diana's father, Stephen Proctor, was a time walker, and that there is a chance that Diana is a time walker too, because apparently she's been doing it since she was a wee tiny child. We learn also that Marcus and Miriam are coming to visit. Before they get there, Sarah and Diana have a complicated conversation about Mart's tea, where we learn that it is contraceptive and full of abortifacient herbs. Marcus and Miriam arrive. There is some tension. M tries to make them feel comfortable. Miriam gets right down to business, even though Sarah and Matthew are in the still room trying to play with Ashmole 782, and they basically drop a load of information on Diana about how old her lineage is in terms of witch history, and how many powers she has because she has vanishing twin syndrome. She basically ate her baby boy twin in the womb and has absorbed all of his powers, so she is Super Diana, right? And she has all of his powers as well as all of her own. That's exactly what's happening here.
No,
so Super
go on.
Diana,
I'm enjoying it very much.
And then we have a very, very hard conversation about the fact that Miriam and Marcus believe that Matthew and Diana might actually be able to reproduce in the normal way, as opposed to via resurrection or any other... Excuse you?
That was my vampire fangs. I want to suck your blood, Katarina.
No, it's entirely okay. It was just very funny because all of a sudden you were hissing at me. Digression, y'all. But so we discovered that it's possible for, or at least Marcus and Miriam think that it's possible for Diana and Matthew to conceive the normal way and discuss the possibility of species extinction, but also of evolution and creation, which is very, very interesting to me. And then basically all hell breaks loose because Miriam decides that now is the perfect time to tell everyone everything awful about Matthew. Sarah begins to have a hissy fit. The house kicks Matthew and Diana out into the yard where they basically reconcile and decide that they're going to face the challenges ahead of them together. They come back in and they form Matthew's little tiny fighting army up against the congregation and who knows what else. I think I've actually skipped a couple things between here and there, but I'm satisfied that we will talk about them.
You know what? There are so many things in these 3 chapters that I think that it is fine. I think you did fine, given the fact that these 3 chapters cover more, plot, and there's more information dumped in these 3 chapters than, most of the last half of the book. So
this is absolutely true. How do you feel about getting this much content as we enter Act 3?
It's a lot. Frankly, it's exhausting. When I was rereading it to do my notes, I was like, it's so much. And that's not to say that I can think of like a better place to put any of it or that any of it is like strictly unnecessary, but it's just like, it's a bit of a slog and it's very exhausting to read it through and really try to unpick every single thing that's happening because there are so many things.
And I think that's because there's just so much new information or so many things that recontextualize what we already know about the story that's happening. And so while I think we get a great deal of payoff for things that have come earlier in the book, it's also just a very dense set of chapters, and it feels like it puts a great deal of weight on Act 3 that perhaps feels so meaningful because it does happen basically in the space of about 24 hours, or at least that's what it feels like. And I think that canonically, if you look at the real-time reading, that is true. It either all happens like kind of at the same time or within like 24 hours, and that's a lot to absorb for anybody, especially coming off the heels of LaPierre. I feel like we were just kind of getting to a place where LaPierre, I mean, it happened, but I also feel like we've recovered from it quite speedily.
Yes. Yeah. Given how traumatic it was, and now we're just like steamrolling into the next thing. And honestly, I was thinking about this the first time I read the book. I think in these 3 chapters, there were quite a few things that I missed the first a couple of times. And this time when I went back to take notes, I was like, oh, that's there too. But I totally missed it because there's so many other things going on. So... And, we'll get there when we get there. So starting off in chapter 34, I have a question for you, just like a moment of levity at the beginning of 34, because I don't know the answer to it, but Diana makes this comment when Matthew is meditating, and she's like, meditation is the only rest that you get. And I'm like, since when do we know this is true? Like, is this just an assumption we're making? Is this just Diana being Diana? Like, what is this about? And it's not like a deep, like, textual thing. I was just thinking about it.
It actually snagged me too because I think that the text is just asserting that because he doesn't sleep, yoga and meditation are the way that he recharges, which is fine. It doesn't really bother me, but I was like, yeah, I don't know that we've discussed that before, but moving on. I think that what I take away from this passage is the conversation that Matthew and Diana are having about how to connect with the life force and how to sort of like relax and let the water move through her, I think says a great deal about the importance of presence and stillness to not only her magic, but to her healing. The fact that she's not trying terribly hard, she's just sort of existing in the space and time with the magic and letting it move through her. That seems to be far more successful than her normal approach, which is to take it head on. And I wish that she sort of let that happen. But I do think that it conflicts a little bit with the necessity, or pardon me, with the device of having the magic be attached to her need, because I don't really think that that's happening here. I don't know what she needs.
Right. And that's something, I guess, in a couple of pages we're going to be talking about, like, need and desire when we come to the butter. But you're right, and I think that's something we have to talk about in these 3 chapters, is this conflicting ideas between need and want and desire, and then just simple, I guess, like, release, like, just kind of letting yourself adrift versus need and want and desire. Like, in this instance, she seems much more to just be kind of like present in the moment and not needing, wanting, or desiring anything. So,
well, as a counterpoint to that, as I'm sitting here thinking about it, maybe because we do get an indication that some of her magic is not necessarily tied to the kind of need or want that is conscious. It is tied to sort of like when she is going about her daily life, when she is not so wrapped up in things, that's when the magic happens. Like when she needed Ashmole 782, or when she needs the butter, or when she needs to feel connected, right? Maybe that's the thing that's going on. And when she's sitting there going, I need, then the magic is saying, no, you don't actually need that. You know, like it's more about you being sort of like relaxed and unguarded, and then your true needs, or even like little n needs and big N needs, are clearer.
Although we can get to my semantic difficulties with these 3 chapters when we get to the butter in a second, but I have a couple others.
Go there right now.
I have just like one more thing.
Okay.
While we're,
we can get to the butter.
So it struck me in these, particularly in 34 and a little bit in 35, like Matthew a bit mansplaining magic to Diana, like particularly in the beginning of 34. And I was reading it this time around and I was like, how do you know, dude? Like, and he's all, la, 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 I knew it. And I was like, okay, but like, you don't know anything about magic for reals.
Yeah. You know, I think that, and this is not to make an excuse for Matthew, but I think that like Matthew delights in feeling like he's the person who knows the most in the room.
Yeah.
You know, and he's just that kind of a dude. And I think that sometimes it gets the better of him. And when something works, he's like, aha, eureka, I knew that would work. And you're like,
no, you didn't. I'm like,
no,
like here, I'm like, okay, so you've lived in a house with witches for 2 days and now suddenly you know all the things about magic. Like that's what's happening now.
Right. Whereas like, yeah. And I think that go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there are other points in the book in the series where he and Diana mutually work through magic together or mutually discover things about magic, and it is far less of Matthew just like sitting there and splaining things. In this case, that is not what is happening, and so that's why it kind of like sticks out to me.
Yeah, I think that Matthew in these couple chapters, they're not the time that I find him the most difficult. But I do think that one of the things that we're seeing from Matthew in the Bishop House is that he's decidedly off balance. Like it's textual that he's clearly enchanted by the Bishop House, and who wouldn't be? But he's off balance. He's not at home. He doesn't feel comfortable there. He finds it to be overwhelming. And so I sort of see that as his insecurity trying to exert control over something. Like I feel like I see that from him a couple times in these chapters. And so it doesn't throw me out. I'm just sort of like, yeah, you don't know what you're talking. Let you think you know what you're talking about, because Diana's lapping it up. She's like, someone tell me. Like, someone tell me how this works. I'll take any explanation you have.
Anything goes. Anything goes. I think you're right on that. It just, I was giggling to myself about it. It wasn't so much irritating like he is irritating other times. It was more just funny to me in this particular instance.
Right. He is speaking out of his proverbially very fine
yes, exactly. Yeah. And then we get to the butter. basically.
What do you think it is about this moment that opens her to the magic and allows her to do this?
I think perhaps she either has a very fine love of calories or or she's just kind of in this moment where she's very at home and at peace, and so that's when, things happen. I would like to point out, however, that she does not need the butter. She just wants the butter for a 9th piece of toast. And so semantically, to me, I have great difficulty with that. Because then we turn around in like 4 pages and we're like, oh, it's about need, not want. And I'm like, but she only wanted the butter, you guys. She only wanted it.
So, Professor Jen, would you like to have a conversation about the semantic difference between need and want?
Okay. So, I mean, this feels really obvious to me. But, okay. So, if you want something, your body doesn't necessarily require it. Your person doesn't require it. You just want it because you either like it or you have a desire for it or, whatever. When you need something, that is when either your person needs something to survive. Like, for example, in this case, she doesn't need butter to survive. She's not in a fight or flight situation. She's not in any situation where she physically is in need of butter. That was a poor explanation, but you see where I'm going with this. There's a difference.
I do, absolutely. And I see where you're going with it. And I wonder if the definition, that just stabbed me in the foot, right? Because I was going to say, does the semantic difference matter? And it has to matter because Matthew rather smugly says in 3 pages, oh, you wanted that. You didn't need it.
Yep. And it wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't directly called out in the text, the difference between wanting and needing something, but it is. And I throw my pen.
I throw my pen at the semantics.
So that is really the only reason that it becomes extremely difficult is because Matthew is a smug little poo. And points that out to us, and I'm like, well, now it matters, doesn't it?
Way to ruin things, Matthew. Way to do it. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just like a more expansive definition of need, than you would traditionally employ, or maybe like solely wanting something to happen, or wanting it with the kind of intensity that's like, I want Santa Claus to come to my house. I want it to snow tomorrow. Perhaps it is related to things that are not like so intensely focused, or like maybe there's a certain degree of like not thinking about it. Mm-hmm. That is right. A predicate.
I think you are right about it being more a subconscious intention in most of the cases where her magic works better. However, subconscious intent is never like called out to us. It is only like want versus need versus desire. So, which is, of course, my stumbling block with all of this.
We should talk a little bit when we get there about the difference between want and desire, because I think that is a really interesting dichotomy to draw. But first I want to point out on page 441, which is the page after the butter, that happens on 440, for those of you following along in the text. I do love that sweet baby Tabitha brings a dead mouse to Matthew and that he treats it with the gravity it deserves.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but she is still indignant because he does not want this mouse. How could you not want this mouse, Matthew?
Which means she's basically a cat. That's no surprise.
Yeah, it's adorable.
Let's talk about the letter.
Mm-hmm. Before we like tumble down that well of despair and heartbreak, I just adore that the house steals things and keeps them. Like, we have this whole laundry list of things that have just disappeared in the Bishop house.
And that M just sort of patiently waits for things to be returned, and hopes that, if the house is at it again, maybe I'll get my gravy boat back.
Right, yes. She got her knitting back, so, and maybe the house is just like, I don't care what you want. I'm just going to give you the things. It doesn't matter which one of them you actually want right now.
Yeah, although I think that that's also kind of curious in the course of the books with respect to the Bishop House and what the Bishop House gives you because, like, it's time, or what it just randomly gives you because its magic is acting up. And I asked this question on the discussion group, but I don't know that we've discussed the answer. How do you think the Bishop House got to be the Bishop House?
That's a very good, like, was it just that way because it's a witch's house, or did somebody enchant the Bishop House, basically? Or has it kind of taken in all of the magic, sort of like through osmosis, all of the magic and all of the ghosts, and kind of like become its own entity over however many hundreds of years it's been there? I kind of like that idea the most, actually. Out of the three.
That's kind of what I had in mind, like some sort of like accumulation of magical residue and like ghostly apparition-y like bits that just all of a sudden one day the house wakes up because all
creating accidental sentience.
Right. Accidental sentience is actually a very good way to describe it. But having like the house be embodied by sort of all this excess magic and being not only like the familial seat of the bishops, but also being like a sort of collective memory unto itself, where the house, like the bishops may forget, the house never does.
Yeah.
I rather like that.
Mm-hmm. I do too. And do you think, okay, so do you think the house actually differentiates between things that are given to it and things that it just steals and collects because it wants them? So the things that are given to it and then it holds on to them.
Like the letter.
Kind of like a lockbox or something, like the letter, for example, in this chapter.
It's like a time capsule.
Yes, exactly. Versus the things where it's just like, I fancy this, I shall take it.
I rather like the idea of the house just having like the occasional kleptomania and being like, and this is mine, and this is mine, and this is mine. Like, I really like that. As opposed to, the house being like necessarily selective, because it does seem to be a little bit random. So I kind of imagine the Bishop House as being like, the crazy aunt, who's kind of like a bit of a hoarder, right? And very good at like remembering your birthday, but also not great about picking out a present.
Mm-hmm. But we'll just like walk by and is like, this is interesting. Let me just
scooping it all into some sort of like a carpet bag and taking it elsewhere. Maybe that's it. Maybe there is a distinction between things like the page from Asheville 782, which Stephen and Rebecca clearly gave the house for safekeeping, and things where it just says yoink. And maybe that's just the house, although it doesn't necessarily explain why then in the process of giving back the things it has yoinked, it also gives back the things that are like timely.
Well, perhaps that's just like a storage issue. Like it's like, oh, I've set all these other things on top of it and I need to like, in the subsequent years I've covered it over with other things and I need to get rid of those things first, and then here's the thing that I'm actually supposed to give you.
Oh, I like that rather a lot. If it's just in like reverse order of all the things that it has taken.
Yeah.
That would be kind of amazing.
Just like a shuffling of the shelves, behind the scenes in the house.
Like somehow every time I go to Trader Joe's, I manage to put like my wallet and my shopping bags at the bottom of the cart, and then it's full of food and I have to unload it and then get to the things I actually need to pay. This happens to me every time. And you would think and then, that walking in there, I would be like, I shouldn't do this again. But I get so distracted that I
every time. The house is like you at Trader Joe's. And then if your basket is full, like some things fall out. Like it's just like this whole production to your wallet.
It is a production. Me going to the grocery store is definitely a production. But I very much like the idea that the house just sort of keeps things and then gives them back as it sees fit. But it does seem to have like a loyalty and a feeling of special responsibility for members of the family, which I like very much as well.
Okay, now we can get sad.
Okay. Ooh, so, every time I think we're done being sad about Stephen and Rebecca, we get sadder and sadder and more tragic.
We come to our next reading and we're like, oh yeah. So I guess an easy question. What do you think of Stephen and Rebecca's letter as a device in the book?
I think that it is very effective for some of the reasons I think we talked about before, where I don't think that when we first encounter Stephen and Rebecca and they're in the oubliette, and we're dealing basically with child Diana, I don't think that she's in a position to absorb this. I think that this is clearly meant for adult Diana. And so I think that for me, the letter as a device, particularly coming with the page from Ashmole 782 and coming under these circumstances, works really nicely. How does it work for you?
I like it quite a lot. And I like this idea. It makes sense to me given how much we know already of Stephen and Rebecca and how like careful they were and how carefully planned out this all was, that of course they would have left this letter with the house, you know, kind of detailing everything that they had gone through and providing not necessarily closure for Diana, but more explanation of some of the things that she has been grappling with up until this point in the book. And the fact that they understand how difficult some of those things like the spellbinding are for her to have discovered and have dealt with for all of this time. So I like it in that respect. And I like them delivering the page of the manuscript because as a reader, you come across that, you know, the first time and you're like, oh, that's the plot thickens. Like there's a new twist in this story.
I think that one of the things the letter does really nicely is that it pulls together a bunch of disparate threads. So you have all those little bits earlier in the story about the witches coming to the Bishop Proctor house. And we have, you know, Rebecca crying over Stephen's shoulder as he's writing this in this portion. We have the talk of like the congregation and the congregation basically trying to open Diana up, and we have all of these things that I think set us up beautifully for the realization that, or for the revelation that Stephen and Rebecca were basically throwing the congregation off of Diana's scent, that it was Diana that they wanted all along and Diana who was special, but they made this incredible sacrifice to save her. And I think that this letter puts us very squarely in the middle of our central narrative conflict and then Diana's identity conflict, because it takes some of that sting of the spellbinding and what is wrong with me out and allows her to process just how dedicated to her parents were.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And yeah, like you said, that revelation that Stephen and Rebecca were essentially deflecting all of the focus of the congregation onto Stephen. I mean, to both of them, but to Stephen, and off of Diana, and kind of convincing them that Stephen was the one that they wanted the whole time. And it's very difficult to think about it because it's like, it's so tragic.
But it also has echoes of when we get to Miriam, when we talk about some of the biology and genetic stuff, like it also rings true with what she's talking about with reproduction and species evolution, with the parents trying to draw predators, to draw danger away from the offspring because the offspring are more important. They're the next step, right? So I think it's a really nice echo of that. And it's just, like I already said in an earlier episode, I think that one of the really great things about Stephen and Rebecca as characters is how present they are, even though they're absent, that you know who Rebecca is from reading this. And when you combine it with that woman who, in the beginning of the book, is staring into the reflecting bit, or when she's floating at home, you begin to see her in really great detail. And it's really good character work. And when they first cast Rebecca for the TV series, I was like, how much work does Rebecca really have to do? And now I'm like,
she does a lot.
So I think that I apologize to Sophie Miles and anybody else who is a huge Rebecca fan. I just accidentally wrote her off a good deal. I'm very sorry. I apologize. Mea culpa.
And I think that device of Diana being able to brush her fingers over the writing and be able to see them works really nicely when it comes to Stephen and Rebecca, because we do get them so richly when otherwise we couldn't have them, because you can't flashback all of the time. But if you make it a power, you know, it's a little bit easier to justify, you know, having her do it and having, you know, seeing them there with us.
It's also a convenient and a useful tool for moving the plot along in a way that doesn't require a great deal of toing and froing. You know, she can basically sort of like fast forward to the crucial information by putting her hand on the page, which I think is great. You know, it's a great shortcut for all of the plot work that we have to do in these chapters. I'd like to stick a pin in page 444 where they talk about the Israeli stamp, and that's going to be a long-term pin where I'd like to talk about that much later.
Yeah. I would like to stick a pin also in 444, but in a different place, because on 444 we get the lines from the epigraph. We get, you know, the missing page, and we get the page on top of that, which has our lines from the epigraph in this kind of like scrawled print. At this point, we don't know who wrote it. We just know that it's in the packet. It's kind of safe to assume that one of Diana's parents wrote it, but we're not really sure. And to me, without spoiling anything, to me, reading it through, I actually missed it the first time I read it. And this time through, it reads to me very much like a spell.
Oh, I never thought of it that way.
I hadn't either until last night, and I was like, whoa, that like, it reads like a spell. Like it's just like, and it's a pin where I have to put a pin in it.
Oh, I wonder. How is this a long-term pin or a short-term pin?
Oh, well, it's until Shadow of Night pin when we get more discussion of spells, basically.
Oh, okay. Fine.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think the immediate pin that we can go ahead and remove because it's in this reading is, do you think that is part of the spell that Stephen wrote to enchant the book?
I feel like perhaps it is, you know, if not the whole thing, then part of the spell.
Which is so interesting because isn't that also inscribed on the first page of Ashmole 782 anyway?
Is it? I thought not. Now we have to go back to the beginning. Flip. I thought not, but I could just be completely... No, the only thing that is in Ashmole 782 are the notes about Anthropologia, or a treatise containing a short description of man, and then Stephen's note in two parts, the first anatomical and the second psychological. This is page 11, by the way, in the paperback, where she's discussing. And then after that, she basically cannot decipher anything else in the book because it is damaged, because the pages are missing. So this is the first time that we get those three lines in the context of the book and not as an epigraph. I believe. It could be totally wrong, but... No.
You are correct. I stand corrected, and we will go back. We will skip forward 443 pages. And... yeah, I think its usage here is really nicely done. And even though, like, I find that on successive reads, the bit where they're like, I wonder if it means this, I wonder if it means that, is a little bit tedious, I still think that the initial use of it has a great deal of...
Anyway, that is my feeling and what I think it is, and we can certainly discuss it further when we get into subsequent books and even the end of the series, decide what that epigraph is, what we think it is.
What do you think of the device of having the page that they receive be so clearly symbolically connected to the two of them? What do you think that the text is trying to tell us about this page?
Well, it opens up we've kind of been hovering around and circling around this discussion of fate and intent in terms of Matthew and Diana. Because we know Rebecca was a seer, that she saw, you know, the shadowed man for Diana. And we've kind of had some other discussions in previous chapters that were circling around the idea of fate, that they were fated to be together. But now with this page, we're certainly drawing it in a stronger hand and kind of like pointing to it and being like, they were fated to be together.
It's a pretty good device. I mean, I think that it does have a little bit of the, you know, well, is everything about them in the book? And I think that textually the answer is yes. It is actually not just about them, but about if the book is important to all creatures, then they are also important to all creatures in a way that is novel and unusual. And so as long as I look at it as the kind of thing where, like, this is just the way that it is, and that some seer like Rebecca, I think it's much easier to stomach knowing that like a seer like Rebecca exists in this world, where it is possible that somebody who maybe illuminated this manuscript or who wrote it could have foreseen the two of them. And so that makes it easier for me to stomach that particular coincidence, whereas I think in other stories where maybe this wasn't present before, I would find it to be a bit too twee, but I think it works very nicely here. And I honestly can't wait to see the World of All Souls, because I certainly hope that the illustrator has done a version of this for the World of All Souls. Like, I would love to see these 3 pages illuminated and to see what the rest of the manuscript might look like in its idealized form.
So you wanted to talk a little bit, or a lot, about alchemical imagery. So on this page, we have the image that represents the alchemical wedding in the first step in creating the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone, the alchemist was kind of like the pinnacle of alchemy. And the Philosopher's Stone was said to bring eternal life to whoever could make it and have it and own it. So tell us about alchemical symbolism, Kate.
So, I mean, some of this is just textual, right? Where Diana talks a lot about how the alchemists basically used all of these metaphorical and allegorical ways of describing both the materials that they used and then the processes that they subjected them to try and make the Philosopher's Stone. So some of that is textual, but what I really was interested in talking about comes a bit later, and I'm just going to go ahead and do it now because why not? It's in chapter 35, and on page 457, when Sarah says, "What's the unicorn for?" And the unicorn is really super cool in alchemy. I did a little bit of this while we were doing the real-time reading and some of the symbolism, but a lot of the imagery behind alchemy is about the combination between gold and mercury to try and create the Philosopher's Stone. And the unicorn symbolizes mercury, but also life and resurrection. The companion animals for the unicorn in alchemical imagery are the lion, the dragon, and the eagle. So many of those are present in the All Souls trilogy in one way or another. You know, Matthew refers to Diana as Malion, and we'll stick a pin in the dragon bit.
And the lion is present in this illustration as well, is it not, along with the unicorn?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And all of those animals represent gold, and the combination of mercury and gold was supposed to be about the union between the soul and the spirit, especially when combined with the imagery of the stag. And the idea of basically celestial motherhood, which I found really interesting, that like the unicorn is supposed to symbolize like the pure beginning, the prima materia, virginity, not in the sexual sense, but in the sense of like all things are possible and all things come from this, which I thought was like really, really deep and lovely. And the thing that's so funny to me about 457 is that Sarah's just kind of like, "What's the unicorn for?" And then we like run away from it.
Yeah.
And that's a pin that will continue to develop. But the idea of the unicorn as both mythical and mutable, as like not entirely one thing or the other, particularly as a symbol of masculine and feminine together, which is interesting to me because we get all that vanishing twin stuff in 35. It just seems really cool. I like it. I like the use of it, and I like that we just sort of like skate past the menagerie and the unicorn's going, "Look at me." Yeah.
It is very nicely and lightly done. I think in some of the other books, the alchemical imagery is a bit more heavily discussed and doesn't work quite as well, but this is very nicely and lightly done. And by the way, 445 is where we get the first description, just for the listeners to follow. 445 is where we get the first description of the actual illustration. And then, as you said, later in 35, we get the actual like calling out the unicorn. And now we know what that means. Before we go to 35, there are a couple other things in 34 that I wanted to touch on, which is that actually a bunch of things.
I wasn't ready to move on.
So,
I was just skipping ahead.
Oh, excellent.
Just skipping ahead because of the unicorn bit.
Well, because we were talking about it. It was topical. So we have this indication that Diana used to dream about Matthew. She does not remember. That Diana, in fact, used to dream about a shadowed man when she was younger, before her parents spellbound her. And Rebecca knows about it because she could see Diana's dreams, and then she wrote about it in the letter. And that that's 446, by the way. And then they tied her magic to her feelings for Matthew. That's on 447. So,
which absolutely supports the thing that you said about the dock and how when they look at each other with this thing that is not revulsion, that is the moment when her magic sort of starts to creep out of the woodwork.
Right. Yes. And then, so I think having Rebecca know that Diana has been dreaming about him, and also having had Rebecca see him in the future and understanding him to be important, and therefore tying Diana's magic to this person, though she doesn't quite know who he is quite good. It's quite good.
Mm-hmm. Although, I mean, maybe I'm just like too pragmatic a human, but I'm sort of like, but there's a possibility that they never would have found each other. Like, there's a chance that this never would have happened, except that you're making the this is fate,
fatey
this is
fate.
Story, leave it alone.
But
yes,
fatey fate.
I know. I am sorry. my investment of belief is struggling just because
I know.
I'm a nervous Nelly.
I understand. Timey wimey.
Timey-wimey. I don't think that the story is necessarily weakened or undermined by the idea of them having been fated for one another. I think it gives the story like a sort of a tighter shape, like we know we're going somewhere, and that this is in fact larger than the two of them. I like that while we spent basically the first 2/3 of the book with Matthew and Diana sort of pretending that they're all alone in the world came for them at Sept-Tour. And now we're finding out that they are actually, despite their desire to live quietly looking at manuscripts together for the rest of eternity, that they are actually connected to something larger. And I think that works very,
Which
very
is
nice.
something that we discussed a little bit when we had our initial discussion about Diana's white table, that the white table doesn't quite work for her in that instance because she doesn't have nearly enough puzzle pieces. And now we kind of are discovering exactly how big the puzzle is. And of course she couldn't figure it out because she has like 3 pieces out of like a 10,000 piece puzzle.
It sort of reminds me of a scene in Alias. Mm-hmm. Did you ever watch Alias?
I did not, but go on.
Okay, well, just indulge
I
me,
will.
Right? There's this moment where the whole premise of Alias is that the Jennifer Garner character's name is Sydney Bristow, and she is a spy, and she believes all along that she's been working for the good guys until she mentions what she does for a living to her fiancé, and her job kills him, murders him in their house. And she discovers she's been working for a terrorist organization the entire time, basically. So she walks into the CIA and like says, this is how you take down the evil SD6, and the male protagonist basically says, okay, fine, sit down with a piece of paper, draw me the organizational map of SD6. And she does it, and then he gives her an overlay that's 4 times the size of the table that they're using, and he's like, you have no idea what you're talking about, right? Like, you only know this tiny, tiny piece of this puzzle, and it's like 1,000 times bigger than you. And check yourself before you wreck yourself, which, not quite analogous, but I always think of Diana having that same, to an extent, like a kind of arrogance about understanding where she fits in the world, or maybe that's just the arrogance that is born of hiding and thinking you haven't been discovered. I haven't really played with that yet.
I don't know that it's arrogant so much as just this kind of like very pleasing ignorance.
Ostrich.
Yes, exactly. Yes. The ground is much more interesting than the outside world.
It's also a lot safer, isn't it? Yeah. So I think that all of the stuff that Rebecca and Stephen leave in that letter is lovely and heartbreaking.
And you kind of like, you go through, at least I do, flipping pages, and I'm, at least when I was making notes for it, you know, you get kind of a paragraph and then a reaction, and a paragraph and a reaction, a paragraph from the letter and then a reaction. And you're kind of flipping through the pages. I'm like, oh my God, the letter's still going. And then I'm like, and then there's another paragraph. Okay, now we have to like feel terrible and cry about that. And then we flip the page and there's another paragraph. But now we have to feel terrible, cry about that. This chapter is a lot of emotional heavy lifting for a reader.
What do you think of the significance of Diana being a call bearer and being between? What do you think the text is telling us about Diana when it uses that?
So I do like the significance of the call bearing in terms of, the powerful seer, all of those things. But quite frankly, when I get to the end of these 3 chapters, we have this laundry list of things that Diana is, and most of them I do not care about. By the time we get to the end of this, I'm like, okay, this is too many things. Like, this is so much scaffolding to explain Diana, essentially, is what we're getting, kind of a skyscraper's worth of scaffolding to put Diana up there with all of the witchiest witch powers. I think it's very tricky. What do you think of it?
I like it as an aspect of her vulnerability, this idea that in part her inability to sort of find her way is also based on the fact that she is quote unquote between worlds, that insofar as we put stock in the witchy symbol of the cowl, she is a being whose path, though her parents say that she's been walking it since the day she was born, is not always clear to her, and that it's certainly an uncomfortable and terrifying place to be. So I like that as an aspect of her character, because I think that it helps me connect to her, that her insecurity and her inability to choose and some of her indecisiveness is not just about the fact that she's a little bit weakened and a little bit compromised, but it's also about the fact that the choices before her are different and more difficult than perhaps for other people that came before, because of what she can do and who she is. So that helps me connect. Ooh, I wanted to talk about this thing on 448, where at the end of Rebecca's letter, she says, "If we have wronged you, it was because we loved you so much." How true do you think that is in general, either from the perspective of the All Soul series or sort of walking it back to the rest of the world? Does that hold water for you?
I think I don't see it so much as them wronging her as much as it is consequences of things that they had to do. Like, saying that they wronged her implies intent, and that is not something that they didn't intend to do her harm or to wrong her. And so for me, it's not really accurate in terms of what actually happened. I think there were just things, and they apologized for the other things, the anxiety and, the spellbinding and all those things were kind of like explained and apologized for. So I don't really think that you need that final bit there at the end. I don't know. What do you think about it?
I was sort of wondering whether that can be said of, like, whether that's a comment on parenting. That especially for only children, and only children who come into the world and they are beloved by both of their parents, that sometimes they're unintentionally or incidentally compromised by decisions that their parents make for or about them, for which there is no going back or there is no undoing. And so I was sort of rolling that one around for a bit.
Yeah, and I think compromised is a more accurate description. I don't think wronged is, just because of the implication of being wronged. So
right, because that sort of implies,
or she was made vulnerable and compromised, but not wronged. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, I think that the text presents the argument that Stephen and Rebecca's actions are justified, but do we think that's true? Do we think that they were justified in doing what they did?
I think perhaps, okay, well, this becomes difficult because Rebecca's a seer, and so this kind of like what was going to happen was always going to happen, and it doesn't, that sort of timey-wimey thing. But other than that, I think just like parenting-wise, this was the option that they perhaps saw as their only option, and whatever happens in the interim time happens, and that eventually it will all be fine, but not right now.
Yeah, I do sort of wonder about that interaction between what Stephen and Rebecca did, and if that part, particularly if the spellbinding was something that she saw. Like, if that's something that she saw as a way to keep Diana safe until Matthew arrived, which is what M seems to suggest Rebecca thought was happening. So maybe she saw Matthew but didn't see how Diana was going to find Matthew, and so this was sort of the, like, putting the cork in the bottle. But I mean, I think it's hard to process on 450 this idea of being wronged, because there's certainly a part of Diana, I think, when she first learns about it, that feels very much wronged, that feels very angry about the amount of time in her life that she has thought that she was basically not a witch enough, or that she was not a real bishop, or that these consequences are really injurious to her.
Right. And I think feeling wronged and actually being wronged, of course, are separate in the interpretation versus the intent of, whoever was doing whatever they were doing. I'm just not sure it was helpful for them to write it down, because I'm not sure it's true. So.
Well, if I had to take back every letter I've ever written, especially in a moment of, like, high emotion, I'm not really sure I could stand by them all. So.
Or not be embarrassed by all of them.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this podcast and you have one of my letters, this is not a cue for you to drag it out and read it on the internet, right? Like, I'm just saying.
For example.
So I really like on 451 and 452, right before we get into chapter 35, Diana having the outburst about Marcus, which I think is absolutely charming, where she's just insistent that he and Miriam will stay at the house, and that, like, he's her son now, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Like, this is just how it is. And the idea of family and similarity and difference, right? She's willing to adopt and be a part of this very different family, while on page 452, basically her entire family is looking on, and there's this idea of similarity that, like, just bishops are this ornery, and all of the ghosts are nodding in agreement, like, yes, we are all of the same stock, we're all nutty, like, we're all very difficult witches. So I like that composition of similarity and difference.
I like it, and I think it's charming as well. However, it does also bring back to mind Whoop's accidental marriage, which by BT Dubs in this chapter, she has yet to tell her aunts about any of that. So that's why when it comes up in the end, they're like, excuse me? Right? Huh?
Well, to be fair, Diana missed it too. So it did kind of like, yes. And also, like, one should not be a step-parent by accident. Understanding that Marcus is a fully grown, fully realized vampire human. At the same time, like, that's one of the things that talking about commitment and baggage and, like, expectations of partners is really important. That's real important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, there's a tangent I could go off on, but I'm not going to, so that's fine.
Restraint. Look at us.
Because it's about another book series, and I just am not interested in going there. But we do get a character introduction right at the very end of this chapter, or a mention of a character whom we not had before, or not very much of anyway. We get Elaine at the end of this chapter, which we find out Mart made him a vampire, and 449 is where he comes up, and which really indicates to us that he's a big, brawny, burly man, and also a vampire servant, another vampire servant.
Who was apparently made a vampire servant by another vampire servant. So the fact that Alain is, like, Mart's son is also very, very strange. And we need to unpick at some point.
So
like,
is this then, like, the servant family? Like,
that,
the Claremont servant family?
I know. But
it's very upstairs, downstairs now.
It is very upstairs, downstairs. But it also makes me wonder, like, I mean, you do get eternal life, and you always have nice things around you, and at least you have something to do.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I don't know.
Other than just acquire money.
Right.
I mean, it's not a spoiler to say we do find out later that both, like, all of the vampire servants are actually by this time quite wealthy on their own. That's not a spoiler, but, you know.
Perhaps they just like to be busy.
It's really not relevant. Yes. They just, have type A personalities. They're busybodies, like to do things. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. We don't really ever deal with like vampire class, and perhaps that's just a device because all the vampire families are like old and well established, and like they all have more money than Croesus, right? And like maybe that's just not a thing we're interested in discovering, is whether they're actually different classes of vampire family. But then we get to chapter 35, and we get a big old plot bomb.
Hey, y'all, Steven's a time walker. 454. The second page of the chapter. Okay, is this a good time to discuss time travel?
This is a good time to discuss time travel and how we sort of do like hand-wavy mechanics about time travel on 457. So I guess like we should take a brief detour into talking about time travel literature and how difficult it is to do, because discussing the mechanics of your time travel almost always makes the time travel fall flat.
Worse. Yeah, it makes it, the more you try to explain it, the worse it gets.
And really the only answer, like there's sort of a question of like linear time travel versus circular time travel. The linear idea being that you only move in like one of two directions, and that things happen in a certain order, and you kind of do one of these things. I'm gesturing with my hand in a way that makes no sense, so none of you are missing anything. But the idea that like there are consequences of your time travel, and then the other one being the idea that
the stable time
loop where it's all circular, so it doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter.
So it doesn't matter.
And
yes,
for some reason, I think a lot of authors get stuck in like needing a stable time loop because it's the only one that doesn't make your brain go to mush, but they all worry about it being linear.
Right. And really, I mean, again, unless you're coming at time travel from like a strictly theoretical science standpoint, which will make your brain turn to mush, it's really best just to not go into the mechanics of time travel at all in fiction. Yes. So you oftentimes get, it is the case in these novels and in other novels, fantasy novels, and some sci-fi novels, where what you do end up with is a stable time loop. Things happen. Things were always supposed to happen. Things were always going to happen. It doesn't matter what you do. It just all goes around and around and around. But you have the author and the characters worrying like, if we go to the past, what is going to happen? What can we possibly change? Da, 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 da. And like having that tension there. And it either stems from, to me, an incomplete understanding of like the mechanics of time travel by the author, or just the need to create tension for the characters, where the characters don't fully understand timey-wimey things, and so they're like...
Or it's in between, because I think that, I don't know that it's necessarily like authors trying to create tension. I do just think that it feels weird not to address the idea, because that is like a very real anxiety that I think almost any character would have, especially if they're not super familiar with time walking, which is why I think it's so funny that we do the hand wavy bit with Stephen just being like, well, it's like trains, you get on, you get off. Which also not very persuasive, but we're just gonna, it doesn't bother me, so we're gonna move past it.
They just hold a space for you. There's just an anteroom, like purgatory, in time, where you are held if someone time walks into your place.
Right. And so I think that for me, like the dissonance comes when we're dealing with a series that relies so heavily on the idea of fate and things were always happening, have always happened. People see this happening in the future. And then we deal with like this idea that you can just like randomly pop back in time. And obviously, I mean, if it's a stable time loop, then the answer is that like it was always possible
Who cares?
for them to do so.
They always did it.
They always did
went
it.
Back in
they
time.
have always gone back, which
yeah,
will stick a pin in it.
Yeah, we have to have this discussion further in Shadow of Night. But currently, our understanding of time travel in the All Souls universe is that it's a stable time loop.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that you just sort of like wait on the platform for your time train to come by.
Uh-huh. And to go to the past, you need 3 items from the past, which makes sense because the past has already happened. And of course, you would have those 3 items. But if you want to go to the future, you have to magic it up a bit because you don't have items from the future. I mean, except that you would have items from the future if you came from the future. I'm just saying.
Well, but that doesn't solve the question of absence, right? Like if you're in the past and you want to go to a future that's beyond the past that you left, and you don't want to come back like right when you left, then like you just have to sort of like think real hard.
Sure.
I don't
click your heels. Like I said, really just trying to explain it just makes it worse. So
right. We're just gonna
this is just a perfect example.
We're just going to enjoy the fact that it happens or that it's possible and move the flip on. On 458, I actually drew the eye roll emoji because I think Matthew is terrified, and that's the only reason I can come up with why he's suddenly like, well, Diana, I'm forbidding you from doing this thing and you will absolutely listen to me. And this is final.
Does he forbid her from time walking? Did I just totally miss that?
So he doesn't totally forbid her from time walking.
Maybe I was stuck on the T, which is also on 458. So
true. It's a very lawyerly answer of you to say he doesn't forbid her from time walking. He does say she can't go back to 1859. And sort of is like, I put my foot down. And you're like, you're freaking scared. Like you are absolutely terrified.
Right, and also, like, it's kind of textual that Diana has not been able to time walk since she was spellbound, so, like, why are we even having this conversation, Matthew?
Well, you know, she can conjure the butter. Who knows what else she's capable of?
The butter that she just felt like having for her next piece of toast. I can't.
She needed it, Jen. She needed it.
She didn't need the butter.
She needed it.
She was not running an extreme caloric deficit. She did not need
butter. Is more important to her than it is to you. That's where we have to come down on this. What?
I like butter a lot. I just made shortbread cookies yesterday. I do enjoy butter. Anyway, dear listeners, now that I'm ranting about butter again, for 56, we have the discussion of Ashmole 782. And we're talking about how prior to this, we talked about how Stephen had contact with it at some point. He, in fact, wrote in it. And then we have this discussion again of desire and want. And Matthew saying that the fact that Diana didn't need the book was why she couldn't recall it again when she tried to go back to the library and recall it. And that is on the middle of 456, where he says, you didn't need it. You only wanted it. Just like, you know, the butter.
Butter, enchanted manuscript, same.
How do we feel about the word desire?
Ooh. I think that on a spectrum, it is closer to want than it is to need. Although I do think that you can also desire, that is like very deeply yearn for a thing that you actually need. And so I think that it is, if there's a triangle, like the need, want, desire triangle, I feel like it sits between the other two at the top, if that makes sense.
Yes. I certainly feel that it is also somewhat the middle ground between those two things.
I think it is loftier, or it is I think that people use desire to describe some unsatisfied or somewhat intangible thing that I just keep coming back to the word desire, which is unhelpful, by the way. But no,
they desire
this sort of intangible thing that they can't quite place their fingers on, or maybe like they see something and they say, yes, that is what I desire. That is the thing. That is the idealized version of my want that I also translate into a certain kind of like spiritual or emotional need.
Yes. And we are, of course, are talking in terms of like the broadest definition of desire in today, like in real life. The desire is most frequently used in terms of like sex and romance. However, the broader definition of it, I think, throughout history is much more of, like you said, an intangible, almost metaphysical want/need.
Do we think that when the inscription or the epigraph or whatever we're calling it in the text as opposed to before the text, what do you think that is doing with absence and desire? Is that supposed to be a dichotomy? Is that supposed to be like, because I don't necessarily see that absence and desire are on some kind of like a balance. or that they're opposites. I think that maybe they're combined, like they're twined a little bit. Like you can desire something that is absent and not know what it is.
Right. Yeah, I feel like in the case of this inscription, the desire is the recognition of the absence. The one is the recognition of the other.
Oh, I like that a lot.
Because you can have absence and not necessarily think about it or realize it or care about it, but then adding the desire to it indicates that you are recognizing that absence of whatever the thing is.
Right. Well, and, I think that they both deal with a not having, right? But the desire, I think, is also interesting because it could also be a feature of something that you have. Like you have it, but you also desire it, like it is a thing that is somehow fulfilling to you. And so I think that it's interesting that those are almost juxtaposed, but not quite, because desire, I think, is not necessarily mitigated by presence.
Sure. But I do feel like they are juxtaposed a little bit because absence is much more passive and desire is much more active, I think, between the two. So I think they are a bit opposite in that way. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. What do you think of, we talked about this at the very, very beginning, but what do you think of absence and fear being there together? Do we make anything of that at this point?
I don't know that we know enough to make anything of that one at this point. To me. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Because, of course, the fear is on the second line with the blood and, but preceded by absence. So, I don't know. What do you think about it?
I think that we have sort of the loose outlines of it just because I find it to be so resonant with, for me, like how much of both Matthew and Diana at this point is motivated by fear or is at least controlled by their fear of something. And I think that as we go on, we can talk about whether Matthew and Diana are scared of the right things. It is remarkable to me the journey that we have to go to get them to focus on what's actually important as opposed to what they think is important. And so I think that that's like kind of the beginning of the fear conversation, but I'm not really sure about how all of those concepts fit together. And I think that that's maybe a worthwhile topic for part of our wrap-up episode to think whether how we have dealt with all of those items in the course of the novel. So let's put a pin in that.
Although I will say that I think what you said about them being afraid of the right things ties very nicely into our discussion of Matthew being afraid and him, coming and kind of lashing out at this idea of her time traveling to 1856. Like, is that the thing that you really need to worry about right now? That he definitely does have fear, but not of the right things. Or he doesn't express it in the direction of the right things.
But I will submit it as another piece of support for my argument that when Matthew is terrified, he clamps down. Like he finds a way to try and exert control and like being like, no, I absolutely forbid you to do this thing that makes me very uncomfortable.
And that also I have like zero control over.
Right, that you have zero control over, but somehow he seems to repeatedly believe that will work.
If I say it enough, I will have control over it.
Yeah, speaking of things over which you should have control, let's talk about contraception.
So the tea. I mean, that wasn't really... We had her tea. We kind of left it there, except for if you know anything about herbology, you know what all of those things were. So it's not really like a spoiler. It's just something... It's more of a conflict generator that we have that's coming up now amongst the other conflict. I'm not sure it's a conversation we need to have right now, frankly. Except that it goes along with our Conceptio conversation, but... I
just sort of...
It's just a lot.
It is sort of a lot, but it's also one of those things where it just bothers me because I agree with Sarah that you shouldn't be taking herbs or anything that you don't know what they're doing, and I'm a little upset with Mart and Isabeau for not being like, once upon a time when the world was new. Like, I made this tea for everyone in the village because it keeps your womb free of vampire babies.
Potentially.
Theoretically. If that's theoretically possible.
Right.
Like, let's not find out till we know.
Right.
All right?
And I feel like, okay, so this has been Sarah's stance all along, which is like, don't handle things that you know nothing about. Like, don't touch things, don't eat things, don't drink things that you know nothing about. That's been Sarah this whole time. For Mart, I feel like I don't want to excuse it, but I think perhaps Mart may have had the impression that because Diana is a witch that she knew what those things were.
Yeah. Although I don't know that I
Isabeau, not so much. My Izzy-boo, I don't have so much of an excuse for, but Mart, I can think of more that Mart was just like, of course she's a witch. Like, she knows what all of these things are. Like,
well,
whatever.
Except that it's so clear that Diana is clueless that I have trouble stomaching that as well. Like, if Mart has to teach her all the names of the 12 herbs, and like, let me direct you guys to my post on the real-time reading about this tea and everything that is contained in it. If you have too much of several of the things that are in Mart's tea, it's very, 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 very bad. Like,
no
so
bueno.
many
It's
of them
so bad.
are meant to prevent a fetus from taking hold in the uterus, and then some of them are actually abortifacients, meaning that they're meant to expel a fetus or a fertilized egg from actually ever settling in the womb lining. And any one of them in excess can be poisonous, right? Like, they are fundamentally poisonous. And some of them are just amenagogues, which are herbal remedies for making one's menstrual cycle come. So, like...
Right. But the ones that are, intended to abort are in fact like intended to cause bleeding.
Correct. Right.
So lots of things that cause bleeding in too many quantities equals dead person because you've bled out now.
Yes. So I think that I'm comfortable leaving the conversation there for now, just because I just think that it was irresponsible of Mart, and that it's a bit of a betrayal of Diana and of Diana's intelligence and of Diana's agency over her own body, not to tell her what she's ingesting and why, and just to be like, no, mademoiselle, this is just a tisane for your health.
Mm-hmm. Tasty tea.
That's great tea. So on 460, we have a charming moment where Matthew talks about how, despite the fact that Marcus is neither French nor Italian, his education has compensated for both, which I really enjoy, actually. I like the idea that Marcus was sort of like this rough and tough American colonial, and then his French father said, no, but I want you to know things.
Yeah. It is nice.
If you're going to live forever, grow some taste.
Yeah. It is very nice that, like, the latter half of 35, before we get the big bomb there at the end, we do have a bit of a break and a breather and some levity with Matthew and Sarah, going off, running away and doing magical things, magical and sciencey things. And we have this whole discussion of Marcus, and it's all very lovely and much needed break.
Yes. And I like that Sarah
and perhaps too short.
I like that Sarah's inviting Matthew in. While I appreciate that Sarah and Em are skeptical of Matthew and how much they push back on Diana, I also really like that she says, oh, okay, you're not so bad. Not until 36. And 36, you're the worst. But as of right this minute, I like you pretty good.
Mm-hmm. She's warming to him a bit.
She is warming to him in a way that suggests that he can basically see, the family jewels,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love, too, that Diana is, absurdly worried about this manuscript page, as any, good historian would be. And then the scientist and the witch are like, it's fine.
Right. We're not going to do anything to it, it's just kind of...
Mom,
it's really
we're just going to look at it.
And I also love that it sort of calls back to the moment where Sarah was healing Diana, and Matthew sort of looked on ooh, do it again. And that he is enjoying the expression of the witch's power, as something that he was reportedly or reputedly repulsed by, afraid of, whatever Matthew's issue with witches was. He seems to be getting over it rather quickly.
Right, except for, Amir, who he was fine with, so.
Right, who knows?
Whatever. Selective issues with witches.
Well, to be fair, Amir is awesome.
She is awesome. I mean, I don't have a problem with her either, except we don't get enough of her.
I do like the discussion of witch lineage and how important families are in witches, and how important it is that spells have this provenance and who they came from, and why it is that witches always bear the name of the first woman of the family. I think that part is actually quite nice, and it's it is more background on like what it means to be a witch and part of a witch family than I think we've really had so far.
Yes. I'm not sure, because it is, again, a lot of information. Like, much of what we get in these 3 chapters is just like a huge info dump. I'm not sure that we need it here. I think perhaps it's a conversation we could have had in the last 3 chapters or the 3 chapters before that. I agree that it's excellent, you know, more history of witches, because we haven't hung out with a lot of witches yet, so we don't know a lot about them. And it is important in this discussion of family to have the discussion of the bishop lineage and all of that stuff. It's just like, it's so much by this point that I'm just like, I'm tired now.
Yeah, and I think that when we finish the book, you know, I think that this bit is just like kind of structurally fascinating, because I'm not entirely sure why we are doing all of this now, other than I think it is also support for my argument that this book should end earlier than it does. But I'm going to stick a pin in that.
Yeah, we're holding that for like one more reading. Or till the end, till the wrap up.
I think we're going to hold that to the wrap up. But I think that one of my arguments has to do with how much meat we get here that I think actually belongs in Shadow of Night. And that's just my personal read on the structure. And like, I just think that this weights down this section of the book in the way that feels like we're rushing when we were taking a relatively leisurely pace before. But then Marcus and Miriam arrive, and Marcus is adorable. And he's just precious.
He's adorable. Yeah. And I love really quite a lot, like, him charming Sarah with the bottle of whiskey, like,
hello, Auntie.
Your namesake also liked whiskey. Here's some whiskey.
Right. I've lived a long time, and I once knew a woman that looked like you, because that's not creepy. And she liked whiskey.
And had your name.
Yeah, she liked whiskey, so maybe you do too?
I mean, you got to give him props for trying. Like, even if Sarah didn't like whiskey, it's like, good job.
I also love on 466 when we have the inevitable confrontation between Sarah and Miriam, where Sarah says, "Goddess, how can anyone ever think you're human?" And Miriam's like, "Well, you're no treat either."
Yeah.
I think that that's nice, and I like...
What is it, like red hair and henbane?
Yes, red hair and henbane, which doesn't sound too bad to me, but I suppose if you're a vampire, then that's a very, very strong set of smells.
And then we just like bull right through and get right down to business in the living room there at the end of the chapter.
Yeah, we do, because Miriam takes no flipping
like,
prisoners. None. Like, she is shoot to kill Miriam.
She comes in the door. I'm here to tell you all. I'm not even going to put my bags down. I just got some things to say.
And you know what? I specifically want to say them to wreck Matthew. Mm-hmm. In talking about, like, the things we
Who's not here, by the way.
Right. In talking about the things that we wanted to say about chapters 34 through 36, both Jen and I have come to the conclusion that while, like, we don't disagree with anything that Miriam says, she's being pretty awful in these chapters. And, like, not just stirring the pot, but basically baiting the bear. Yeah,
she's being the worst. And also...
She is... She's
a wrecking ball, a bulldozer, like whatever disastrous metaphor you want to use for Miriam. She is those things in these chapters. And she's not wrong. She's just like terribly angry. And for all the talk of like not telling other people's stories, she certainly spills a lot of beans that were not her beans.
Well, as we've discussed, that's not entirely consistent, but it could also be that is a thing that vampires do when they're not mad at each other. Mm-hmm.
Oh, they're respectful of each other's stories. They're like, oh, that's your story to tell, blah, 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 blah. But...
Because in fairness, like...
Only because we're friends.
Isabel was kind of mad at Matthew when she told his story to Diana, so...
It's completely true.
That could be the common thread. Listeners, we'd love to hear from you why you think that vampires don't tell tales, but then they so often gossip about one another, it's almost embarrassing.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like a frenemy situation. They're like, well, we're friends. We won't tell each other's secrets, but watch out.
Yeah. And then we get... this whole thing where poor Diana, I do like the way that we deal with this idea of conception as sort of a whammy, right? That we build it up, and maybe it's a 3-beat. I haven't actually looked, but we sort of build it up right at the accidental marriage bit where it's like, is it okay that we'll never have children? And then we have Sarah sort of being like, and then all of a sudden It's Diana knows what's next. What comes after conjunctio, Diana?
Conceptio.
Right, which is, like I don't know what that is. I don't know if it is a 3-beat because I don't know if
I would call it more of a resolution.
Right, maybe it's not.
Because I feel like it's been building also, like if you knew what those herbs were in the tea, it's in fact been building, a bit since there. And now we just get all the resolution of all of those things together at once.
Right. And I like how overwhelming it is because I think that puts you very much in touch with how overwhelmed Diana is. So in terms of putting you in the first person narrative, I find this to be very, very effective. But it also means that, like, sometimes, again, when Diana's being unreasonable later in this chapter and when she's not being, like, terribly perspicacious, it is difficult to get around the fact that she's just she's winging it. She's winging it hard.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, she wasn't exactly expecting to have to discuss all these things in front of everyone right now. Thanks, Miriam. Thanks.
Yes.
I mean, we all do things that are regrettable when we're stuck in situations that we were definitely not planning on being in.
Yeah, but the nice thing about it is that it does carry over some of that alchemical imagery and the idea that when you combine the elements of the alchemical marriage, when you combine the prima materia with other substances and you make the Philosopher's Stone, I like the idea that the Philosopher's Stone is like a genetic super combination. I do think that metaphor is very resonant, so long as we don't get too sciencey. And again, like, I think that the science doesn't bother me because it's not my wheelhouse, and so I don't notice when it is incorrect. But I do think that it is a nice way of bringing all these themes together and having a reason why Diana and Matthew are so important.
I like it on a conceptual level. I think in 36, where we try to smush the science and the more fantastical aspects together, is where we run into trouble, because we do get a little splainy with the science, and it's not effective. And it's not that I'm like a super scientist either, but I know enough about it it's just a lot of scaffolding again, to kind of like try to put all of these pieces together to make it possible for Matthew and Diana. And I feel like the less we explain about it, like time travel, the better.
Right. Although I do think that there's thematic weight and significance to the idea of Diana and Sarah belonging to like a separate clan, something that adds to the idea of them being witches apart and being, of a line that is different than other witches, which, again, sticking a pin in this for like why Diana matters and why she has such a strong connection to powers that the witches that they thought were going extinct or that they thought would never resurface again. So I think that works very nicely, but I do agree with you that I don't know that we could do it without all of the sciencey stuff. I don't know that there's a way to do it, because then I think you lose something, but I also don't necessarily think that laying basically like a genetics textbook like right in the middle of 36 is the most effective tool.
Right. I think in a way you could just like say it's genetics and leave it at that. Like leave
genetics.
Well, no, I mean like because they are scientists, so there has to be some like aspect of explanation about it. But just going into the deep, like nitty-gritty details of genetics is not as necessary as I think it's shown to be in the text. It's as necessary as the text thinks that it is. Certainly not as necessary as Miriam and Marcus and Matthew think it is, pontificating about it for like 10 pages.
Pontificating, and then Miriam's not quite done yet. She's like, oh, well, there's one window I haven't smashed. So let me talk about the fact that Matthew murdered Julian. And everybody knows our feelings on this, so I feel decently comfortable just like sort of saying, ugh. But I think it's interesting that we spend 478 trying to basically contextualize Julian's death by saying that she was ambitious and that she'd been spying on Diana for years, as though that's a justification, as though that somehow makes her death more proportional. And it doesn't work. M's right. Like, this is beyond the pale.
I would just, before we like continue forward, because I feel like we skirted over the genetics like conversation a little bit without any page numbers. So I just want to say the discussion of Diana having a vanishing twin is 470. The discussion of Apollo and Diana and the fact that Rebecca knew that she had a twin is 471. And then 473, we get the whole discussion of cross-species breeding. And then after that comes witch clans. And we talk about Lilith, the first witch, on 475. And then mixed children in 476.
Ooh, and while we're on the subject of Diana and Apollo, it's not only important that they were twins, but they were the twin sun and moon god, which of course in alchemy not only represents the chemical marriage, but then also the union of the masculine and the feminine, and the soul and the spirit. So, all of those dualities are incredibly important, masculine and feminine, and the idea that, I think that there is a conversation we could have about whether Diana represents necessarily the feminine in a way that Matthew represents the masculine, because I don't think that's quite true. I think that Diana is in a way whole unto herself because of these things that she can do and because of her sort of space betweenness.
We talked about this a little before we started recording, but how do you feel about Diana as a twin? And like that's how part of why she became the witchiest witch. How much do you feel that's necessary?
I feel that it is necessary for reasons I'm going to have to stick a pin in until Shadow of Night
Book
and
of
Book
Life.
of Life. Okay. Really, truly, I don't think that it is like the most useful thing now, but I think that it helps me understand how Diana can be Rebecca and Stephen's child in ways that are like fundamentally significant to the story of witches, vampires, demons, magic in the world.
I think you are correct in the broader context of the trilogy. It works. I would say for a first-time reader, for somebody who has only read this book, I could see how it's very off-putting. Because basically at this point we have tons and tons of powers. She's
all of Hogwarts in one human.
Right. We have all these powers. We have her being spellbound. We have her as a callbearer. We now have her as a chimera. She has a vanished twin. We, go into this whole thing of her being Mercury. We have, and so like by this, I'm just like, okay, I'm done now. I'm done now.
Like there are a lot of layers on this, like a lot.
Yes, and it's almost you would be excused for thinking it is too much currently in just this book. That would be okay. Anyway, we were talking about Matthew being a killer, which by the way is 477. Diana saying Matthew wasn't a killer. Diana, that's quotes by the way. 477. Diana, Matthew wasn't a killer, but like he is. So, and we've covered this already. So
it is, and we have to be okay with it because at some point Matthew kills to survive, and we've both watched him kill for actual survival and kill out of anger, so we need to face that head on about Matthew, and I think we're much better about that as we go forward. But in this book, like, I don't know whether it's the text trying to reconcile it or whether it's Diana trying to reconcile it that makes it so difficult for me. On the other hand, I do absolutely love on 479 and 480 when Diana calls home to Satur and she talks to Isabeau. I really I heart that all over.
Yes, I love it a lot. Also, just prior to that, we get some of Miriam's story and kind of a bit of an explanation of why she is in fact so peeved and so interested in just like bulldozing through Matthew and like everything that's going on. It seems to be a lot of like pent up anger that she's been holding on to for like centuries and has just now decided to...
But here's the question. Like on 477, she refers to Bertrand not only as like Matthew's best friend, but also as her husband, as opposed to her mate. Do you think that that's significant?
I do think it's significant, but we can't talk about it yet until Book of Life.
Okay, fair enough.
I do think it's significant, yes.
The fact that we can't talk about a lot of this until Book of Life means that like the overall story craft and like the laying of individual like bricks that have payoff is actually like really, really
as
great.
A trilogy.
But it also means
just right now.
Right now it's like I'm chomping at the bit. But I love the conversation with Isabeau. I love that line where she says on 480, and happiness is always louder than sadness. And the idea that, like, despite how much difficulty they're going through, like, they have the capacity to be happy together.
Does that imply that the Bishop house itself and the Bishop household is happier than the de Clermont household? Just in terms of, like, okay, so you have the house, which is an entity, which is alive, which is very noisy. You have all the ghosts. You have all these people, like the house making noise all the time.
Maybe, yeah.
There's just a lot more going on than at Septor, than at Seven Towers.
I think that there is a lot more going on, and I also think that that is like the difference that we've talked about before between vampires standing out of time and witches being almost like intensely in and of time. You know, so much of what Sarah is talking about is like tied to the time when individual members of the Bishop family lived and died. I wonder if there's something to be said there about the temporal nature of like a witch's power and a witch's life.
Sure. And that you kind of have to make the most of it. Like, time is more immediate. And so therefore we're not going to be as clean and organized and, you know, divided.
Right. Or just as removed, you know, because I think that it's fair to say that witches as a species are pretty nosy. Like, I think when we get farther into the series, it's pretty clear that, like, witches just don't stay out of other people's business. Like, you don't see anyone coming around to Matthew and be like, come over to my house for Mabon.
Wink.
Wink, wink.
It's not sinister.
Come be with other witches. Come be with other vampires. No, people are leaving him the F alone because he's nuts.
Yes.
And then Matthew and Diana kind of discuss children. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
479. We have a lovely Bishop ghost telling Diana that it doesn't matter what she chooses because every path has Matthew in it. The unnamed ghost, who we later learn is somebody, but it's not really a spoiler. She just doesn't have a name yet.
So Matthew and Diana sort of like have this kind of awkward conversation about, well, I thought we couldn't have children, but now maybe we can. We would do. And I do think that it is reasonable for Matthew to be of the position that, like, until and unless we're sure, like, we need to do something about it that is more than herbal. You know, we will, this needs to be like an active choice.
Sure. I also think that Matthew's being domineering about something that he doesn't really have a right to be domineering about, because since we're talking about choice, Diana still does not have all the necessary information. I mean, they're not fooling around. Obviously, since they're talking about birth control, that's a thing that both of them foresee happening in the future. However, as we previously discussed, there are a lot of things that Diana doesn't know yet. Still.
And a lot of things that are just a necessary conversation to have before you decide to have children. Anybody's children.
Perhaps during this conversation, perhaps during their apple tree snuggle time that we did skip over, but it happened. I don't want to share you with other people. And by the way, there's some bonding issues.
By the way, some bonding issues, and by the way, like some other stuff about me.
Some family drama, some
like, it's not as simple as like picking out a color for the nursery.
No.
Although I do think it's funny that she says that all babies are vampires, because I have many friends who are new parents and I think they would agree.
Yeah.
They would agree.
Energy, both like physical vampires and also energy vampires.
I think that on 481, where she acknowledges that with or without children, we already have a family to keep together, and the heaviness of the air shifting, some of the responsibility falling on her shoulders, it feels important and it feels right that she should acknowledge that, and that she should take some ownership of the union that they are creating and the family that they will be cobbling together, because up until now it feels pretty ad hoc. But I think the decision when they go out there together, the decision to lead, even if I don't like where she ends up, because I think that comes from a position of vulnerability and fear, if I don't necessarily agree with that, I think that the sentiment is correct.
And we have this nice little thing on 482 where Matthew talks about an old powerful secret unraveling. and that they're caught up in it. And I like the imagery a lot, but we can't talk about it fully yet.
Yes, I like the imagery a lot too, and I also like the idea of Diana as a secret unraveling with the spell binding and the ribbon, and it's really very, very pretty, and kudos. That is very nice imagery. Well done. Full marks, gold star.
Yes, exactly.
Also, the foreshadowing on page 483, where Sarah confronts Matthew and sort of says, hey, if anything or anybody threatened Diana, you would eliminate them. And he's like, without a doubt. Like, no question.
Problematic. Also foreshadowing. Problematic.
Yes, for sure.
So at the bottom, we have all of the people in the house. We have Sarah and Em and Miriam and Marcus and Matthew and Sarah and all the ghosts and everybody's just like, it's chaos. And this chapter is frankly uncomfortable for me to read because it is so chaotic, because it feels so chaotic, which is kudos to Deb for making it chaotic the way it should be. But you have her at the bottom of 483 kind of like slamming her hand on the table and kind of taking charge, which I really appreciate, and is a precursor of the Diana to come.
Right, the Diana to come who says at the end of the day, like, we're a family, and this is not about us, this is about all the families like us, and the family that we will become, which I think is really lovely. I don't know about the taking the next evolutionary steps. I think that that's laying it on in a way that's not necessarily a bit thick, but it's just not my preference. But I do like that Diana immediately sort of stands up and says, enough, this is what we're doing. I dislike that she then says, and everybody follow
This is Matthew's army? Yeah.
Because not only do I think that that's not necessarily true.
I think it's true for her right now.
Yes. I think that that's out of fear and out of a lack of knowing anything else to do, because she's not ready to trust her own judgment about these things. And she's terrified to lead. You know, she's terrified to stand out.
And I feel like that is Diana's view of her position and Diana's actual position within the army/family is something that we can revisit right literally at the very end of Book of Life. Like the last chapter of Book of Life.
And I think that a part of that is just because she doesn't want to see herself as being anything other than a passenger. I don't think she wants to see herself. I don't know that for all we talk about Diana as a strong female character, which I think we should do at the end of this book, her strength is questionable. And in the sense that, like, her personality is strong, but when we talk about her being a strong female character, it's mostly about how well developed she is, as opposed to like her inherent and innate character in this moment. I'm not saying that she's not a strong person. I'm saying that she is still fundamentally compromised here, where she's not fully inhabiting herself.
She's kind of in this moment grudgingly willing to be strong when she is forced to the brink. When she is forced to be. And then she's like, okay, fine. Yeah.
Like something has to motivate her, either frustration or fear, or she has to be sort of like jarred out of the comfort zone of the first one being hiding or running, and the second one being, well, if I can't hide or run, then I will just hide behind Matthew or run to Matthew, which is maybe a better answer, but not by much.
Yeah.
Not by much. Right.
What do you think of Marcus's little comment about, like, what if we had some demons? Wink, wink. What if we had some demons? We have 3 witches and 3 vampires. What would happen if we had some demons? What would happen, Kate?
Boys and girls, this is like that moment where it's like, it was a perfectly ordinary manuscript. You know, like, never trust a text when it does one of these. Never trust it, because it's lying to you.
It's lying to you. It's just winking at you. It's being clever.
And we end with a very sweet moment of Matthew putting his hand on Diana's tummy and them falling asleep together, which is quite sweet.
I have a question for you.
I hope I have an answer.
What do you think of the shift in the narrative voice there right at the very last line of the chapter?
Yeah.
What do you think of the shift? This is more of my support for Diana as the future narrator of these books, because we have a shift here from the narrator talking to us with everything happening in, let's see, what are we using? A past tense generally. And now we have this omniscient sort of future tense going on there at the very last line. Certainly an omniscient view from the narrator. The narrator popping in and saying, "Yet to be born." Thanks, narrator.
Yeah, I think that you're right, that this is future Diana, and I think that she's speaking with an amount of certainty about their reproductive capabilities that present Diana doesn't have. She can't.
Right. Yeah. And it's not, I mean, it is, the way it is used by the narrator, they're not surrounding it with a question. It's like a fact that's being stated there in the last line.
It is just presented as is.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, just want to point it out.
Fair enough. Well, our next reading will cover 37, 38, and 39. And then after that, we will get into the very last reading of the book. So again, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts for our wrap-up episode or for anything in between, you can find us at chamomileandclovecast@gmail.com or at chamomile N as in November Clove on Twitter.
Yes, indeed. And like we said at the beginning, we have a brand new Facebook discussion group, which you can go and join. And those are the CNC Clovers on Facebook. And you can find that through our Facebook page, which is Chamomile and Clove on Facebook. And
there will also be a link to that group in the post that accompanies this podcast on our website, which is chamomileandclovecast .wordpress.
And I also linked it, I believe, in the contact us section of our website as well. So there's so many ways to find us.
Absolutely. We are everywhere. And we look forward to seeing you guys at All Souls Con if you've bought tickets. If you are coming to the con, we can't wait to meet you. If you're participating online, then we can't wait to hear what you think of it. We will do some special things as we get closer. But in the meantime, we look forward to being excited about the con with you and making plans.
And we look forward to talking to you next time for our next meeting. Thank you for listening. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night.